I was sitting at the kitchen table enjoying a bowl of granola when I was surprised by a sharp knock on my kitchen door. Pondering who it was that would be knocking at 8 o'clock on a Sunday morning, I strode across the tile floor and opened the door. Standing on my porch was a man in his 40s wearing a cheap, crumpled suit. Behind him stood 3 uniformed police officers. This was definitely not a normal Sunday routine. "Mr. Young?" the suit asked, waving his badge. "Do you mind if we come in and ask you a few questions?" "I'm afraid I can only talk to one person at a time, Detective." "What was your name again?" "Cook. Detective Richard Cook. I'll be asking the questions, Mr. Young. These men would like to inspect your home, if you don't mind," the detective added. "Do you have a warrant?" "I've seen enough cop shows to know that you need a warrant to break into my house to look around, as you put it," I stated. "No, sir, we don't have a warrant. I'm asking for permission for these officers to look around your house. You have the right to deny my request. Then I'll have to get a warrant," the detective agreed. I really couldn't remember what I would have to hide, but I didn't know what they were looking for. Illegal porn on my laptop? Doesn't ring a bell. Couple of dead bodies in the freezer? Probably still unlikely. Right, a couple of illegally copied DVDs. "You're not Interpol, are you?" I asked quickly. "No, Mr. Young. Believe me, we're not interested in illegally copied movies. Everyone's always worried about that," the detective admitted, shaking his head slowly. "Would you mind telling me what this is about, then?" I asked politely. "Quite unusual for this neighborhood. Why do you want to search my house?" "Sir, there's been a murder and I'm investigating it. These officers are helping me. Is there any reason you want to deny my request?" Detective Cook asked. "Well, yes, because I can. Because I don't want a bunch of strangers wandering around my house. Because the floors are clean and I want them to stay that way or my wife will give me hell when she wakes up," I replied. "Is that reason enough? How about I drag your ass down to the station and interrogate you for 5 or 6 hours while my colleagues get a search warrant and go through your clean house with a fucking fine-toothed comb?" Cook growled. "You gentlemen can go in and look around while I entertain Detective Cook," I said, addressing the 3 uniformed police officers. I wasn't sure why the cops were so eager to search my house, but I was pretty sure they wouldn't find anything horrible, except maybe those damn tags the kids had ripped off their mattresses and carried past the cash register 15 years ago. If tensions escalated, Cook could go to the University of Pennsylvania and arrest both my sons. At one time, I had no tongue to warn them about the illegality of removing those damned labels. I pointed to Cook's chair as 3 uniformed men entered the kitchen. I watched as they slowed down and stopped at the island in the center of the room. They turned almost simultaneously to look in my direction. "Only one at a time," I muttered as this holy trinity dived into my box of fresh donuts. I had bought a dozen jelly donuts minutes before their arrival, and their aroma triggered their professional instincts. At that moment, my wife June entered the kitchen, treading carefully, holding the collar of her robe tightly to her throat. "Steve, what's going on? Why are police officers walking around our house eating donuts? Is something wrong?" she asked worriedly. "June, this is Detective Cook. I hope he will enlighten us about the situation by asking his questions." I allowed them to look around, which was the euphemism Cook called the action. "Detective, this is my wife June. Why don't you tell us why you're here? Investigating a murder? Mr. Robert Morgan was shot and killed last night around midnight. I suppose you both knew him?" "Well, yes. He was June's boss. You must have no shortage of suspects, Cook. That bastard was making cuckolds faster than rabbits breed. You should be looking for a jealous husband, maybe even a whole platoon," I grinned, feeling no sadness at all over the death of my wife's late employer. No one else even smiled. June's face turned whiter than I'd ever seen it, and tears came to her eyes. Cook only nodded slightly, studying my face. Except for June's quiet sobs, there was a dead silence in the room. "Mrs. Young, how long have you been having an affair with your employer, Robert Morgan?" the detective asked. "I didn't really have an affair with him, really," June sobbed. "It was more of a chance encounter. I wasn't in love with him or anything. We first met probably about 6 months ago. I would never have shot anyone, much less Bob. I never suggested that, Mrs. Young. I'm just trying to get all the facts together, Cook stated dryly. How your husband reacted to your affair with Mr. Morgan? Was he jealous? Angry? Angry when he found out? Steve had no idea I'd cheated on him until that moment, Mr. Cook. The subject, of course, was never discussed between us. I'm sure Steve would have been upset, but it wasn't enough to kill Bob, June replied, albeit with less conviction than I would have liked from my wife. Really? Grumbled the detective. Mr. Young, how would you answer the same questions? They began dating on August 9th of this year, I answered calmly. It was after a dinner party at the Morgans. I was called in early because of work problems. He offered June a ride home and fucked her in the back seat of his SUV. I'm not upset because June and I have an unspoken agreement. Simply put, we can have anyone we want, and we do. June decided to have Morgan. It was a matter between just the two of them. My revelation made June's mouth drop almost to the floor. It took her a few seconds to process all the information I had just dumped on the detective. I could see the wheels in my head turning very slowly. Why have I never heard of this so-called agreement? June asked indignantly. Because that's what the word unspoken means, dear, I replied quickly. If we were discussing it, I would say that you and I had a verbal agreement, and if we signed and notarized it, it would be a written agreement. Our agreement was unspoken. Well, it would have been nice if I had known about it, June said. I've tried awfully hard not to let you know about Bob. I think from now on, all our agreements should be verbalized or even documented. This wading through crap is getting on my nerves. The answer to that question doesn't strike me as comprehensive, Cook admitted, reaching into his shirt pocket and pulling out a small tape recorder. You both should know that I record everything you say. Mrs. Young, did you date other gentlemen? Or was Mr. Morgan your only lover? Of course he was, June protested, perhaps overemphasized. I am a married woman. How can you even ask me such questions? As far as you know, your husband took advantage of this unspoken agreement or was completely faithful to you, Cook asked. Steve would never break our marriage vows, detective, June replied somewhat indignantly. He's as faithful as an old dog. You can have that on record. Mr. Young, I'm asking you the same questions again. Do you agree with your wife's answers? June has had her colleague Bill Anderson since September 15th. Not counting the ties to those two aforementioned bastards, she's as loyal to me as that damn geyser that proudly bears that name in one of our national parks, I answered without emotion. June let out a barely audible sigh. You seem like a remarkably well-informed husband, and even more surprising is your lack of emotion, the detective remarked. Many men would be angry and consider murder if they knew their wife was entertaining two lovers. Why are you so calm about all this, Mr. Young? Like I said, we have an unspoken agreement. June used to do it practically out in the open, but I was more restrained, if you know what I mean. I smirked shyly. It seemed like June was about to have a stroke. Her eyes had stopped shedding tears. Now they were just popping out of their orbits. Her face was now bright crimson rather than white, and she was crushing a jelly donut with her left hand. The jelly seeped through her fingers and dripped all over her robe, though she didn't even seem to notice it. In other words, are you saying you had a mistress, too? Demanded an answer from the astonished detective. And it seems that your wife didn't know about it. Who was your affair with, and when did it begin, Mr. Young? You're very perceptive. No wonder you became a detective before you were 50, I replied wryly. I made love to Janet Morgan for the first time on August 11th, 2 days after her husband fucked June in the back seat of his car. We've been able to do it almost every weekday since then, I remembered fondly. That naughty girl loves sex so much. In shock, June brought her hand up to her temple. The action caused the jelly she had in her hand to settle on her forehead, and this she didn't seem to notice, and Cook was too polite to get her attention, especially since he was struggling to put together a coherent sentence. Good God! You've been sleeping with the widow of a murder victim, he exclaimed. Every weekday you bored a tunnel into Janet Morgan. I interviewed her briefly last night, and she never once mentioned your name. Is there any chance you're mistaken or trying to make a joke? You want to hear her mention my name, Cook? Hide in her bedroom closet the next time I cover her, and you'll hear her call my name. Of course, I'm not wrong. I distinctly remember the names of all the women I have, for crying out loud.